The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like an electrical hum that never stopped, never wavered, never gave anyone permission to rest. Katie Morrison had been listening to that same frequency for 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, long enough that the sound had become as invisible as her badge, which was exactly how she preferred it. Invisible. Competent. Present but unremarkable, a nurse who showed up, did the work, and didn't ask questions about the hierarchy that kept the ICU running like a military operation, except with less honesty about who was actually in charge. The smell of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee hung in the early morning air as she clocked in at 0613. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation, indistinguishable from every other nurse's. Her name badge read simply, K. Morrison, RN. The photo was 4 years old, from when she'd still been careful about smiling. She wasn't careful anymore. She had learned, a long time ago, that smiling made you memorable, and memorable was dangerous when you were supposed to be erased. Room for 18 sat at the end of the south corridor, the isolation unit reserved for cases that required privacy or separation. When Katie first heard the name Captain James Reeves, the clipboard slipped from her hands and clattered against the tile floor, a sound like bones dropping, sharp and definitive, and she had maybe 2 seconds to collect herself before anyone noticed the tremor in her fingers. She didn't let them see it. Instead, she bent down, retrieved the clipboard with movements that looked routine, and kept walking. Her hands had steadied by the time she reached the nursing station where Marcus, the night shift charge nurse, was finishing his hand-off notes. New admission in for 18, Marcus said without looking up. Spinal trauma, high-level injury, shrapnel fragment lodged at L4. Military case, brought in by private transport around midnight. Family's with him now. Conscious. Katie's voice came out level. Professional. Just a nurse asking the standard questions. Yeah, but he's not speaking. Docs think it's psychological, not neurological. Laryngeal exam was clear. Marcus finally looked at her, and for a moment Katie thought he might see something, some flicker of recognition, but his eyes just moved past her toward the next chart. We've already had 3 consults. Everyone's waiting on neuro and orthopedic to determine if surgery's even viable before we list him for anything else. Katie nodded and moved toward 418 without responding further. The hallway tiles were cold under her shoes, rubber-soled, break-resistant, the kind that didn't make noise. Another advantage of being invisible. You learn to walk through places without leaving echoes. Through the window in the door, she could see him. Captain James Reeves lay in the hospital bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling tiles with the kind of focus most people reserved for understanding their own survival. His mother sat beside him in a visitor's chair that looked too small, too uncomfortable for the exhaustion written across her face. She was holding his hand like she was afraid if she let go, he would disappear. Katie had seen that look before. She'd seen it in mirrors years ago when she'd learned her son wasn't coming home. She stood outside the room for exactly 7 seconds, then knocked and entered with a kind of quiet efficiency that suggested this was routine, just another admission, just another patient requiring intake vitals and a baseline assessment. Her eyes never went to his face first. They went to the monitors, the 4 lines, the chart noting his blood pressure at 118/76, high for someone in his condition, stress response, sympathetic nervous system in overdrive. I'm Katie Morrison, one of your nurses, she said, keeping her attention on the vital signs board. I'll be managing your care this morning. His mother looked up with a desperate expression of someone trying to read competence in a stranger's face. Will he be okay? The doctor said something about complications, about the shrapnel being too close to. We're going to monitor him closely, Katie said. It wasn't evasion, not exactly. It was the truth wrapped in the kind of vagueness that hospitals had perfected over centuries of not promising anything they couldn't deliver. And then James Reeves moved his eyes from the ceiling to her face, and recognition was like a physical contact, like hands gripping her shoulders. Those eyes had seen the same things she had. They had seen Kandahar. They had seen the valley where Daniel's platoon had been ambushed outside San Jin, where James had carried her son's body 7 miles through enemy fire while the rest of the squad provided cover fire, where someone, James, had made the call to move instead of call for medevac, because medevac meant exposure, meant more bodies on the ground. Katie's next breath came in through her nose. Her hands remained steady, checking his oxygen saturation, documenting the reading on the chart. In and out. Professional. Invisible. "We'll get you settled," she said to his mother, and something in her voice must have carried weight because the older woman seemed to relax slightly, as if she'd just been given permission to believe that someone in this institution actually knew what they were doing. By 08:47, Katie had returned to the nursing station where 3 charts were stacked in the pending consult queue. She stood at the counter, pretending to review intake notes, while actually listening to the conversations happening in the hallway just out of sight. Dr. Richard Caldwell had arrived for rounds with the kind of entrance that suggested he believed the hospital rearranged itself when he walked through the doors. His voice carried the particular cadence of someone used to being heard without effort. "Room for 18, he was saying to someone, probably the resident trailing behind him like a remora fish. "That's the spinal case. Already consulted with orthopedic, neurosurgery, interventional radiology. The consensus is pretty clear. Too high risk?" The resident sounded young. Hopeful. Still believed problems had solutions. "Impossible," Caldwell said. "Fragments embedded against the anterior longitudinal ligament. Even getting close to it could cause complete paralysis. The surgical risk far exceeds any realistic benefit. We're looking at comfort care only." Katie turned a page on the chart she wasn't actually reading. Around her, the ICU moved in its practiced rhythm, ventilators wheezed, monitors beeped in their relentless cadences, the overhead speakers occasionally crackled with pages for physicians who had somewhere else to be. What happened over the next 6 hours was the thing that most people in medicine never discussed directly, the way they politely collaborated on abandonment. One by one, the specialists arrived, looked at the imaging, and left with variations of the same conclusion. Neurosurgery passed. Orthopedic passed. Interventional radiology passed. By early afternoon, Katie had counted them like markings on a calendar, 8 doctors initially, then spine specialists from 3 different hospitals brought in for second opinions, then the palliative care team who showed up with the particular gentleness reserved for cases where medicine had decided to stop fighting. 20. The number accumulated like a weight, like evidence of something larger than one man's injury, something about what happened when a patient became too expensive, too risky, too likely to result in a lawsuit if something went wrong during an attempted fix. 20 doctors, each one stamping the chart with their implicit agreement, let this go. Katie knew the system. She'd lived inside it long enough to understand how it worked. 20 doctors wasn't a failure of medicine. It was medicine working exactly as designed, risk management disguised as clinical judgment, institutional protection wearing the mask of patient advocacy. She was preparing medications around 14:20 when Caldwell appeared at the nursing station, his manner suggesting he'd just made a decision and was now prepared to implement it with the kind of surgical precision he reserved for administrative matters. "Nurse Morrison," he said, and his tone contained the slight condescension men like him reserved for women in positions where they had no actual power. "You drew room for 18. "Yes, doctor. I'll be recommending comfort care only to the family. The patient's condition is irreversible, the surgical risk is prohibitive, and further invasive intervention would constitute poor stewardship of resources." He paused, perhaps expecting agreement. "I wanted to inform you before the family meeting, so you can prepare the room accordingly." Katie's hands were steady preparing the next medication, an antibiotic drip, routine, nothing that required the concentration she was giving it. "Understood." "Good." Caldwell turned to leave, then stopped. "I know some nurses develop attachments to cases like this. I'm trusting you to remain professionally objective." The words landed with the precision of a blade, testing whether she would accept them or challenge them. Katie kept her eyes on the fall line, on the way the fluid dripped down at exactly the right rate, the way systems could be calibrated to work perfectly if you understood their mechanics. She took one measured breath and looked up. "I'll manage his care," she said quietly. It wasn't insubordination. It was something quieter than that, something that didn't rise to the level where Caldwell could document it as a problem. It was compliance that contained, within its 4 words, a different understanding of what care actually meant. Caldwell left. The nursing station hummed with the sound of machines doing exactly what they'd been designed to do, and Katie stood there with a medication in her hand and the knowledge that in room for 18, a man who had once carried her son through fire now lay waiting to see if anyone in this institution would choose to fight for him. She walked toward that room like she was walking toward something that would demand everything from her, and she did not hesitate. Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through room for 18 like a scalpel through muscle. Katie had been adjusting James's for drip, checking the line that fed antibiotics into his left arm, when the door opened and the chief of surgery entered with James's mother trailing behind him like a woman walking toward a funeral she'd already attended in her dreams. Mrs. Reeves was 73, her hands weathered by 60 years of rural living, and her eyes held the particular exhaustion of a mother who had already buried one son in her heart. "Nurse Morrison," Caldwell said, not a greeting but a summons. His voice possessed that particular quality of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "A word. In front of our patient and his family." Katie stood. She did not turn quickly. She did not appear startled. She turned with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that rushing showed fear, and fear was a weapon in the hands of men like this. Caldwell was 38, legacy-educated, the kind of surgeon who had trained under mentors who trained under mentors, a lineage of privilege that functioned like an inherited title. His watch cost more than Katie's monthly rent. His office had a view of downtown Raleigh. His decisions were treated as commandments because he had spent his entire life in spaces where that was true. "These last 3 days," he began, his eyes moving between Katie and Mrs. Reeves as if he were speaking to both but addressing neither, "Nurse Morrison has demonstrated a troubling pattern of sentimental attachment to hopeless cases. Cases that consume resources, nursing hours, and institutional bandwidth that could be allocated to patients with actual survival probability." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. "This represents a fundamental breach of professional judgment." Katie's shoulders remained level. Her hands did not clench. She took one measured breath through her nose and held it for exactly 4 counts, a technique she had learned in a place that no longer officially existed. "The reality," Caldwell continued, turning slightly toward Mrs. Reeves, "is that your son's case presents a spinal injury with fusion requirements that exceed our surgical capacity. 20 doctors, I personally consulted with 20 specialists, have evaluated Captain Reeves and unanimously determined that intervention carries unacceptable risk. The ethical position, the professional position, is acceptance of that consensus. What Nurse Morrison is doing, what she continues to attempt, is substituting her emotional response for medical reality." Mrs. Reeves's mouth opened slightly. Her hands found each other and locked together as if they might otherwise betray her. Katie looked directly at Caldwell. Not a glare. Not defiance compressed into a stare. Just direct eye contact, the kind that comes from someone who has stood in rooms where the wrong look could get soldiers killed, and therefore had learned to make every look mean something precise. "With respect, Dr. Caldwell," Katie said, her voice steady and quiet, "I'm managing his comfort care within established protocols." "You're managing his false hope," Caldwell replied, and the words arrived like a backhand. "You're encouraging a family to hold on to an outcome that medicine has already foreclosed. That is cruel. It is also insubordinate." He left before she could respond, but not before posting a formal write-up on the ICU unit board 2 hours later. It was printed on official hospital letterhead, laminated, positioned directly above the schedule where every nurse on the unit would see it before clocking in. The language was precise, bureaucratic, designed to sound objective, performance review notice, emotional compromise in patient management. Nurse Morrison has demonstrated unprofessional attachment to a terminal case, compromising unit resources and potentially undermining institutional risk management protocols. Recommend retraining and supervision adjustment. The words emotional compromise appeared twice. That afternoon, Katie sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had long since cooled to room temperature. The smell of the room was stale, old coffee, microwave popcorn, the particular staleness of a space that existed only as a transition between suffering and more suffering. She had her phone in one hand, scrolling through messages she wasn't reading, when four nurses entered together. She recognized their pattern immediately, the subtle synchronization of people who had coordinated their arrival. They saw her. Their eyes did the calculation. One of them, a woman named Patricia who had worked the same shift for 5 years, actually paused for a moment as if reconsidering. Then she gathered her lunch container and followed the others to a table in the far corner, their backs to Katie like a closing door. Nobody spoke. That was the cruelest part, not the rejection itself but the refinement of it, the absolute absence of even the acknowledgement that she existed in the room. Katie drank the cold coffee anyway. She did not look at them. She did not shift uncomfortably or glance at her watch to signal that she wanted to leave. She sat there for another 12 minutes, finishing the cup with the methodical patience of someone who understood that any sign of distress was a victory being handed to people who had not yet earned it. When Caldwell passed the break room doorway approximately 18 minutes later, Katie met his eyes. She did not rise. She did not call out. She simply held his gaze, and when he slowed his pace slightly, when he realized she was looking directly at him, she delivered the sentence she had prepared with the precision of someone writing an epitaph. A man who mistakes mercy for weakness has never needed either. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Caldwell's step faltered almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. He continued walking, but something in his posture shifted, a recognition that he had struck at someone and discovered, too late, that they did not bruise the way he had expected. Katie returned to the monitors. The machines continued their rhythmic dialogue with one another, the ventilator exchanging breath, the cardiac monitor keeping its steady count, the 4-pump pushing medication in measured doses. These were the conversations that made sense to her. These were the languages she understood in a way that had nothing to do with formal education. At 20:51 hours that evening, James pressed something into her palm. She had been checking his medication port, verifying that the line was patent, when his right hand moved with deliberate slowness. It was the first voluntary movement she had witnessed from him since admission. His fingers uncurled, and there on her skin lay a single dog tag on a chain so broken and corroded it looked like it had survived something that should have been unsurvivable. She looked at the etching. Daniel Morrison. Her son's name, worn smooth by years of being carried against a man's chest through desert heat and monsoon rain and mortar fire and everything else that happened in the places they did not speak of. James's eyes found hers. His mouth did not move, it could not move, not functionally, but his eyes moved, and in that movement was an entire sentence, maybe an entire paragraph. The message assembled itself without words, I carried him 7 miles. He died anyway. Now save me like I couldn't save him. One tear traced Katie's cheek. She did not turn away. She did not excuse herself. She wiped it with the back of her hand while maintaining eye contact with a man whose voice had been taken from him, who was now reduced to the language of hands and eyes and the terrible currency of shared loss. Her other hand closed around the dog tag, and the broken chain bit into her palm, sharp, real, undeniable. I will, she whispered. It was a promise made in a voice that belonged to someone else entirely. It was a promise made by the woman she had buried 6 years ago in the classified rubble of an operation that officially never happened. And as she slipped the dog tag beneath her scrubs, feeling the metal settle against her sternum like a second heartbeat, Katie Morrison understood that the pretense of invisibility was beginning to crack. The monitors shrieked at 0300. Katie heard it before she saw it, that long, flat wail that meant a heart had stopped doing what hearts do. She was 3 doors down, charting vitals on a 78-year-old with congestive heart failure, and the sound pulled her spine straight. Room for 18. James's room. She moved before thinking. Feet on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The crash cart was already rolling toward his room, but she got there first, sliding between the doorframe and a resident who'd frozen mid-stride, staring at the monitor like it might change if he looked hard enough. Clear the room, Katie said. The resident blinked. We need to. Clear. It. Now. Her voice had changed. Something in the timbre had dropped an octave, had acquired the weight of command. The resident heard it. Everyone heard it. 2 nurses, a tech, the night chaplain who always checked on the lonely ones, they moved. They didn't question. They moved. Katie locked the door behind them and turned to James. His chest wasn't rising. The ventilator whooshed empty air into dead lungs. His monitor showed the flatline rhythm of ventricular fibrillation, quivering, not beating, a heart that had given up in the way hearts do when they've had enough. The EKG traced its useless zigzag across the screen. Time was already running out. Every second without perfusion meant neurons dying, tissue dying, the slow cascade of irreversible damage starting its countdown. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital. In a tent made from military surplus canvas, with mortars walking their way up the hillside outside, each explosion closer than the last. The smell of copper and burned plastic and someone's blood on her hands that wasn't her own. A field hospital in Kandahar province, 72 hours of siege, and a soldier with shrapnel in his chest cavity and a heart that had decided to stop cooperating. She was 26 then. She had a rank she couldn't speak aloud anymore. She had hands that knew how to do things no civilian nurse was supposed to know. The crash cart was there. She grabbed the crash kit, her movements precise and economical. No hesitation. No second guessing. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd spent 3,000 hours learning anatomy the hard way, learning it under fire, learning it while command watched and documented everything before they buried all the evidence 6 years later and told her she'd never existed. Katie tore open the thoracotomy kit. The scalpel gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. Not fear. Readiness. This was information. This was data. She'd done this in field hospitals. She could do it here. She prepped his left anterior axilla with betadine, working quickly, efficiently. No time for sterile technique in its formal sense. This was a field protocol, emergency resuscitation, the kind of thing that lived in the gray space between protocol and survival. She found the 5th intercostal space. Her fingers knew where to look. They always did. The scalpel entered skin and muscle with the sound of tearing fabric. She worked through the chest wall methodically. Muscle memory took over. 3rd layer. 4th. Her breath came steady and controlled, in and out, the way she'd been trained. The way she'd learned on a cot in a tent while IEDs detonated in the distance and a medical team depended on her hands not shaking. Blood. Warm. The hiss of air escaping from the cavity. She found the pericardium and opened it with precision. His heart lay there, quivering uselessly, a muscle that had forgotten how to do the only thing it was supposed to do. She cradled it in her palm, cool, slick, the weight of a life in the hollow of her hand. "Come on," she whispered. Not a prayer. An order. Her fingers worked in the rhythm of manual cardiac massage. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The compressions were gentle but firm, deliberate, the pressure of someone who knew exactly how hard a human heart could take before it broke. 100 compressions per minute. The rhythm was a heartbeat all its own, borrowed, temporary, a bridge between his stopped heart and the moment it remembered how to beat on its own. She watched his monitor while her hands worked. Flat line. Still flat line. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. Her jaw tightened but her hand stayed steady. This was the part nobody talked about. This was the part where hope started to look like statistics. Where survival rates became something you could calculate. O2 sat dropping. BP flat line. No electrical activity. 60 seconds. Push epi, she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. The 4 was already in, placed hours ago when he'd been stable and hopeful and his monitor had been showing the steady blip of a man still fighting. She'd placed it herself, back when she was invisible and everyone thought she was just a nurse, just someone who changed bedpans and documented intake and output. The epinephrine went in. 75 seconds. Her hands maintained the rhythm. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Blood pooled around her fingers. She didn't flinch. The monitors showed nothing, registered nothing, reported what she already knew. His heart was a clenched fist refusing to open. 90 seconds. And then the monitor beeped. Once. Twice. A rhythm establishing itself, thin and uncertain, like a voice remembering how to speak. Katie felt it before she saw it on the screen. She felt his heart catch under her palm, felt it remember its purpose, felt the electrical impulse snap through muscle fiber and restart the pump. O2 sat climbed. 68. 72. 79. 85. 88. 92. Stable. She stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at the monitors. Sinus rhythm. Steady pressures. A heart beating on its own again, without her hands to keep it alive. The work was done. The impossible was suddenly, impossibly, real. James's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. His monitor showed the blessed, steady rhythm of a man still fighting. His pupils were reactive. His fingers twitched slightly, he was coming back, his brain still functioning, his life not yet lost to the slow death that came from minutes without oxygen. She'd done it. She'd brought him back from the edge. Katie looked down at her hands. Blood. Sweat. The evidence of something that had no business happening in a hospital, no business happening at all outside of a field hospital in a classified operation that officially never happened and she'd been ordered to forget. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. She grabbed sterile gauze and started closing, her movement still precise, still controlled, even as the reality of what she'd just done started to settle into her consciousness like cold water. The sutures went in methodically. Layer by layer. Her hands remembered this part too. How to close a chest. How to leave no evidence except for the scar. The room was silent except for the monitor's steady beep and the sound of her own breathing. That's when she looked up. The security camera mounted in the corner of the room, the one that was supposed to watch for patient falls and medication errors and all the mundane violations of hospital protocol, had a small red light glowing steady and constant. It had been recording the entire time. It had captured everything. Her hands opening his chest. The scalpel work. The manual massage. The moment his heart remembered how to beat. Every second of an unauthorized surgical procedure performed by a nurse with no license to perform surgery, no legal authority, no documentation, no way to explain what had happened without revealing exactly who she was and why her hands knew how to do this. She stood there, blood drying on her skin, holding the sterile gauze, and watched that little red light blink. What happened next would change everything. Dr. Caldwell reviewed the footage at dawn in the small surveillance room on the 4th floor, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as the screen flickered with grayscale images. Katie's hands moving with impossible precision. The scalpel glinting under fluorescent light. Her fingers inside James Reeves's chest cavity, massaging a heart that had stopped beating 3 minutes and 14 seconds ago. He watched her lips move, counting compressions under her breath. Watched the monitor climb. Watched sinus rhythm return. His face was the color of old pavement. He made the first call at 6:16 a.m. to board member Richardson, whose daughter had married a hospital administrator. "We have a liability crisis," Caldwell said quietly. "An unlicensed employee performed unauthorized surgery. I have the evidence." The second call went to the chief of staff at Duke Medical, a man who owed Caldwell a favor from a malpractice settlement 5 years prior. "I'm documenting everything," Caldwell said. "I need this contained." The third call was internal. "Convene an emergency disciplinary hearing," he told HR, Nurse Morrison, ICU. "Today at 0800. By 7:33 a.m., Katie was standing in Caldwell's office with the sun streaming through windows that faced the parking garage. The termination papers were already printed, her name typed in Century Gothic, the words "unauthorized surgical procedure by non-licensed personnel" underlined twice. "You placed this hospital at catastrophic legal risk," Caldwell said. His voice was measured, almost disappointed, which made it worse than anger. "Regardless of your emotional attachment to this patient, you are not a surgeon. You are not qualified. What you performed was a felony. I'm terminating you effective immediately, pending review by both the State Board of Nursing and the District Attorney's Office." Katie accepted the papers without reading them. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes did not water. She took one measured breath and said, "Captain Reeves is alive. That is irrelevant to protocol violation." "No," Katie said, her voice level as a surgical laser. "It is the only thing that is relevant." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He'd expected tears, arguments, desperate explanations. He'd prepared for weakness. What he got was absolute stillness, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has already survived the worst. It unbalanced him. "Your badge is deactivated. Security will escort you out." She left the papers on his desk and turned toward the door. "Nurse Morrison." He said it like a weapon. "You should have stuck to emptying bedpans." Katie paused at the threshold. She didn't turn around. A man who mistakes mercy for weakness has never needed either. Then she was gone, moving down the hallway with the same fluid precision she'd used to save James's life, as if every step was calculated, conserved, a soldier's gait. The ICU nurses watched her clear her locker. Nobody spoke. The break room had emptied that afternoon before, for nurses gathering their lunches without a word when Katie sat down, but now there was a different quality to the silence. Complicity. Fear. The knowledge that whatever Katie had done, it had been real. At the bottom of her locker, beneath her spare compression socks and a half-eaten protein bar from 3 weeks ago, was a photograph. Her son Daniel in dress uniform, his arm slung around Captain James Reeves at forward operating base Shank, both of them smiling at a camera that no longer existed. She'd kept it sealed in a Ziploc bag hidden where no one would see. She tucked it into her bag without looking at it. The scrub top went to laundry return. She folded it 3 times, the fabric still warm from her body, still carrying the smell of antiseptic and James's blood and the particular metallic tang of a human chest open to the air. She folded it like she was burying something. Like this was a ritual with rules she'd never been taught but somehow understood. The light blue cotton against her palms felt like surrender. Her hand shook once. Just once. She stopped them. Then she walked out through the ER bay doors and didn't look back at the building where James Reeves was lying in room for 18 with a steady heart and a scar that would mark him for life, and she didn't look at the window where she could see the monitors if she turned her head, and she didn't let herself think about 20 doctors and the choice they'd made, and she didn't do any of the things that might have broken her composure. She drove home. Her apartment was quiet in a way that felt like drowning. The walls were the color of old teeth. She'd never decorated. Never hung photographs. Never lived there in any real sense. She was a ghost occupying a space, and now even that space was closing. On the kitchen table sat Daniel's folded flag. She'd received it 5 years ago at a memorial service in Arlington where nobody knew she was his mother, where she'd stood in the back row in civilian clothes because she no longer officially existed, because the operation in Kandahar province that had gotten him killed had been so classified that the Pentagon had erased her from every database, burned her personnel file, and told her if she ever surfaced, she'd be arrested for violating the Espionage Act. They'd given her the choice, disappear or prison. She'd chosen disappearing. She sat at the table and stared at the flag. The triangle was precise. Military sharp. It represented a child she could never acknowledge, a death she could never mourn in public, a sacrifice she could never explain. It represented everything she'd lost by staying invisible. Her phone was dark. No messages. No calls. The nursing board would be calling soon. The DA's office. She had maybe 48 hours before the paperwork caught up to her, before the security footage became evidence, before someone connected the dots and realized that a civilian nurse knew field procedures that only military medics learned. She almost threw the dog tag away. James had pressed it into her palm after she'd spoken to Caldwell that first time, the chain already broken, and she'd kept it hidden in her pocket for 3 days like it was a bomb. Daniel's name engraved on the tarnished metal. 2 dog tags, one belonged to a boy she'd buried, one belonged to a man she'd just saved, and both of them had been under her care and both of them had changed everything. She held the tag over the trash. Let it dangle. Then she heard it. The sound started low, a distant thrum that built like a heartbeat, like the universe learning to pulse. She'd heard this sound 1,000 times, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the dark before dawn when extraction came. Rotor blades cutting air. Multiple aircraft, approaching fast. Katie set the dog tag on the table. She walked to her balcony on the 3rd floor and looked toward Oak Creek Memorial, where the sky was lighting up with navigation lights. The Black Hawk descended toward the medevac pad like a predator landing, and even from this distance she could hear the rotor wash rattling the windows of neighboring buildings, could see the hospital security lights flaring, could sense the controlled chaos of something official arriving without warning. She didn't move. She didn't call anyone. She simply stood on her balcony in the Raleigh night and watched the helicopter land, and somewhere in her chest, in the place where fear and hope collide, a single thought crystallized, *, they found him. *. They had found James Reeves alive. And somehow, impossibly, they were coming for her. The rotor wash hit before the doors burst open. Black Hawk. Military. Not medevac protocol, extraction protocol. Katie stood in her apartment still wearing yesterday's scrubs when the helicopter descended onto Oak Creek Memorial's roof pad, and through her window she watched Delta operators in full tactical gear establish a perimeter around the landing zone. 48 hours since they'd terminated her. 48 hours since she'd folded those scrubs with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She didn't hesitate. She moved like a soldier leaving a safe house, muscle memory carrying her toward the door before her conscious mind caught up. The walk back to the hospital took 11 minutes. She'd timed it during every shift for 3 years, the route she never took, the front entrance reserved for visitors and the guilty. 2 uniformed officers intercepted her in the lobby. Not hospital security. Military. Their posture straightened when they saw her face. Major Morrison. The first one was a lieutenant colonel, 160th saw patches visible on his shoulder, voice like a transmission engaging. "We need you upstairs. Now." She didn't ask why. She followed them into the elevator, and when the doors opened on the ICU, every nurse at the central station froze. The officers flanked her, deliberate positioning, protective formation. They walked directly to James Reeves's room, and what Katie saw stopped her breathing. James was sitting upright. Clear eyes. Awake for the first time in weeks. Not the mute shell she'd resuscitated at 0300, but the man who'd carried her son's body through enemy fire. His mother stood beside the stretcher, tears running in absolute silence, and when James saw Katie, his right hand moved. Deliberate. Precise. Sign language. His mother's voice cracked as she translated, "Major Katie Morrison. Battlefield surgeon. Kandahar province." The room filled with shocked silence. The kind where fluorescent hums become audible. Where badges clatter against tile and stethoscopes drop. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the hallway. His face drained to something resembling old paper, white, fragile, about to tear. The officers didn't move. One of them, a petty officer first class with a silver star ribbon above his pocket, stepped forward. "That is Major Katie Morrison. She outranks everyone in this building. Captain Reeves is her responsibility now." A Navy SEAL commander descended from the stairwell in dress blues, and Katie recognized him immediately, Commander Marcus Hayes, 160th Task Force. Jock. The kind of authority that existed above hospital administration, above everything except the Pentagon itself. He approached the central station slowly, deliberately, each boot strike announcing his presence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of classified operations and untouchable clearance. Major Morrison holds 2 silver stars. Pause. The room absorbed that first medal. The Defense Meritorious Service Medal. The weight doubled. And a classified commendation for saving 43 lives during a 72-hour siege in Kandahar province under conditions most soldiers never survive. He turned to face the assembled medical staff directly. Captain Reeves used back channels to locate the one surgeon in this region who could perform what your 20 physicians deemed impossible. That surgeon is standing in this room. A nurse Katie had never respected, the one who'd mocked her during the break room exile, gasped so sharply she nearly dropped the chart she was holding. Her hands trembled as she read the military file. Every line confirming the impossible. Dr. Caldwell's mouth opened. Nothing emerged. His face cycled through colors, white to gray to a shade of red that suggested either rage or cardiovascular crisis. When the hospital administrator appeared at the far end of the corridor, flanked by 2 attorneys in charcoal suits, Caldwell's expression shifted again. Recognition. Understanding. Betrayal. The administrator's voice was steady, practiced in the language of liability and exposure. Dr. Caldwell, these officers have presented documentation of security footage you attempted to delete from our systems. They've also provided email correspondence showing you buried 3 previous complaints regarding unsafe surgical practices and compromised patient outcomes. That's when something broke in Caldwell's face. Not composure, something deeper. The architects of his entire authority, crumbling in real time. The hospital IT director, a Marine veteran named Morrison with 19 years of service, stepped forward with a tablet. Every second of surveillance footage recovered. Every keystroke logged. Every deletion attempt preserved. The field thoracotomy visible in crystal resolution, Katie's hands moving with absolute precision, her knowledge written in muscle memory, her identity written in every movement across her body. Caldwell's voice when it came was barely a rasp. This is a violation of protocol. Of policy. He stopped. His eyes found the tablet, the footage, the attorney's expressions. Then he made a decision that would define the rest of his professional existence. He lunged forward as if to seize the tablet. 2 officers moved simultaneously, intercepting him with a precision that suggested they'd trained for exactly this scenario. His arm was secured. His momentum halted. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilators breathing in the patient rooms behind the glass. The commander's voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. Stand down, doctor. Federal agents are en route. You're going to want a lawyer who specializes in Medicare fraud, patient endangerment, and obstruction of evidence. What happened next arrived in fragments. FBI badges. NCIS personnel. Caldwell's handcuffs clicking with a finality that echoed down the corridor. His walk past the nursing station where his former allies, nurses who'd praised him, administrators who'd promoted him, turned away in absolute silence. The kind of silence that lasts longer than screaming. 6 months later, Katie received a photograph in the mail from James's mother. The accompanying note contained 3 words written in shaking script: Daniel would be proud. The photograph showed a medical clinic attached to an urgent care facility in Tucson, Arizona. A man in a polo shirt with a name tag reading Steve was mopping floors. His medical license suspended pending investigation. His credentials revoked. His fall from authority so complete that even the fluorescent lights in that strip mall seemed to dim when he passed underneath them. The irony was absolute. Caldwell had built his career on controlling others, weaponizing position, exploiting institutional hierarchy. Now he occupied the lowest rung of medical visibility, invisible in a way that haunted him far worse than obscurity ever haunted her. Katie hung the photograph in her office at Walter Reed Medical Center, Major Morrison restored to the records that had been scrubbed clean. Beside it, framed in glass, were 2 dog tags hanging from a single chain. James's, and beneath it, Daniel's. The son she couldn't save and the soldier she could. Not all victories feel like triumph. Some feel like redemption. She'd been offered the position of Chief of Trauma Surgery, Director of the entire field medicine program, authority that matched her rank, compensation that exceeded anything she'd earned in silence. She declined both. Instead, she worked in the trauma bay in scrubs, the same one she'd worn at Oak Creek, the same one she'd folded that final morning when everything collapsed. Because Katie had learned something that 20 doctors learned too late: visibility wasn't the same as service. Authority wasn't the same as healing. A young medic, barely 23, approached her station at 0522. Fresh out of field training, trembling slightly with that particular anxiety that comes from knowing you're unprepared for what you're about to see. Katie recognized the expression. She'd worn it once. "Major Morrison? They said if anything goes wrong, I should find you." Katie didn't smile. Smiling would have broken something. Instead, she placed a steady hand on the medic's shoulder, the same hand that had resuscitated James, the same hand that had held together a field hospital while command deleted her existence. Nothing goes wrong if you trust your training. And your instincts. Come on. As they moved toward the incoming helicopters, rotor wash beginning to shake the tarmac beneath their boots, Katie understood what her silence had always protected, not herself. The ability to be useful. To step in when others step back. To be the one person in the room who'd already survived the worst, and therefore could hold the line for anyone else trying to find their way through darkness. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how much power you hold, and choosing to use it only when someone needs saving. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this: would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.